The year was 2060 BCE, approximately. In southern Egypt, a ruler named Ankhtyfy was riding high. Starting as the Great Overlord, the governor or nomarch of major towns and districts, Ankhtyfy had expanded his rule to neighboring communities. Then, he had gone to battle in the north, facing off against rivals in Waset, Thebes or Luxor, and Gebtu or Koptos. Claiming victory, Ankhtyphy's warriors had raided Theban territory, seeking battle. Alas, the Thebans hid in their towns, refusing to fight. But that refusal was an acknowledgement. Ankhtyphy was supreme. As the dust settled on his northern raid, Ankhtyphy could bask in the glow of power. He was victorious in battle. His troops were unchallenged, literally. He was beloved of Horus, and he ruled two shrines important to that god, the towns of Nekhen and Bechdet, or Hierokonpolis and Edfu. So, where to from here? Ankhtyphy decided to expand further, but surprisingly, he didn't go north. His autobiography mentions the raid into Waset or Thebes, but that's it. He didn't try to conquer the territory or integrate it into his state. Maybe, despite their unwillingness to fight, Waset was still too strong to conquer outright. Or perhaps Ankhtyphy was not confident in his ability to occupy and rule that region. Both of those possibilities are entirely reasonable, given what Waset, or Thebes, is about to do in just a few short years. But keeping the focus on Ankhtyphy, it is a curious situation. Whatever his motives, the Theban raid was the last of the recorded northern endeavors. To expand his territory, Ankhtyphy turned his attention back to the south. By now, Ankhtyphy was the overlord of Nekhen, the third district of southern Egypt. He was also the overlord of Wetches Kher, or Edfu, the second district. That left just one more before reaching the limits of Egyptian territory. That province was called Ta Seti, or the Land of the Bow, and you may have heard of its most famous town, the town Elephantine, which the Egyptians called Abu. Abu is an island emerging from the Nile. Since the Old Kingdom at least, and probably much earlier, it has housed a substantial village and important religious center. It was a major frontier town, controlling the river and guarding against incursions. Abu, or Elephantine, was also a trading center, connecting to the southern Nile and to roads heading out towards the oases, deeper into the desert and Africa. This is probably where it gets the name. In ancient Egyptian, Abu can translate as elephant or as ivory. So the town of Abu is probably the town of the ivory trade, where the Egyptians accessed these animals and other valuables of sub-Saharan Africa. So Abu was a valuable place to control if you were looking to increase your wealth. Finally, Abu had been a royal center. It even had a pyramid, a small one, from the 3rd or 4th dynasty. That pyramid is ceremonial, there's no tomb underneath, but it marks the presence of royal administration and control of resources from around 2650 BCE. Abu, the island of Elephantine, was a worthwhile community to rule. As you can imagine, the Overlord wanted some of that. Ankhtyphy does not tell us how or when he took over the island, but at the end of his biography he summarizes major accomplishments and duties. And in that section, Ankhtyphy mentions ruling over these southern lands. Quote, "The hereditary prince, the count, the overseer of priests, the great overlord of Edfu and Nekhen, the overseer of troops, Ankhtyphy the Brave, says, I acted as the overseer of troops for these towns as far as the limits of Abu or Elephantine in the south, and to the limits of Iyunu, Armant, in the north. Never had anything bad happened on account of me. I also acted as the overseer of troops for the recruits of Hefat or Moala, and in any dangerous place where I happened to go. Never did anything bad happen, thanks to my victorious bow and to my excellent plans." End quote. From the description, it sounds like Ankhtyfy ruled up to the border of Abu, its limits or Jeru. In context, this probably means the southern border, and that Ankhtyfy claims military authority over the whole region. He confirms this in another passage where he describes having economic power as well. Quote, "I caused the districts of Nekin, Edfu, Elephantine, and Komombo to live. My grain has reached the district of Dendera and Shabet after these districts had been helped. Never has any overlord who has existed in this region done the same, because I am a brave one with no equal." End quote. So Ankhtyfy claims to have ruled districts all the way to Abu, along with other towns nearby. It's a boastful claim, but there might be some truth to it. The region around Abu, or Elephantine, is some of the least fertile in Egypt. It is rich in other resources, like stone, gems, and metal, but agriculturally, it's quite poor. In other words, Abu could very well depend on outside sustenance and trade to support its population. Ankhtyfy already controlled some prosperous towns to the north. Maybe he could present himself as a life-giver for poorer communities than his. Effectively, Ankhtyfy claims to have managed economic and military affairs for the region of Abu, or Elephantine, and he mentions the nearby town of Nebit, or Komombo, the city of Sobek. Generally, historians interpret this to mean that Ankhtyfy ruled over all of these districts. He commanded the soldiers, he managed the food supply, he governed them as overlord. Basically, Ankhtyfy was the boss of the south, master of the shrines of Horus, Sobek, and the deities of Abu, or Elephantine. He was servant of the gods, master of the soldiers, and leader of the governments. He was kind of like their king. Ankhtyfy never claimed the titles or the imagery of kingship. He never used a cartouche, never called himself the son of Ra or the Horus of gold, or any of that. But the way he behaves governing his southern realm, he seems to be a de facto ruler largely independent from the crown. Ankhtyfy does reference the king of Egypt, living all the way downriver in the north, but in terms of his day-to-day duties and the business he conducts, Ankhtyfy seems to be largely independent. However, while he doesn't call himself a king, Ankhtyfy clearly presents himself as something more than your average, ordinary overlord. Throughout his autobiography, Ankhtyfy builds himself up, and his status, to quite remarkable heights, and he does this in some unusual, even unique ways. For example, in Ankhtyphy's autobiography, he often calls himself, quote, "the vanguard of people and the rearguard of people." In Egyptian, this goes something like Inerkhau remech, Inerkhau remech. We might understand this as Ankhtyphy being the protector who guards his towns and people from all threats and evil. But in 2009, a scholar named Ludwig Morenz offered a different reading, one slightly more kingly. Instead of "I am the vanguard and the rearguard of people," Morenz suggested it could also be read as "I am the beginning of people and the end of people." Or, to put it in slightly more famous terms, "I am the Alpha and the Omega." A more religious reading, for sure, but Ankhtyphy's biography is grandiose and self-aggrandizing. He elevates himself and his achievements far above those of ordinary overlords. And he does it repeatedly, constantly saying things like, "I did that which had never been done before." Now, most Egyptian biographies do that, but Ankhtyphy goes way beyond the average. He repeats this idea over and over and over, constantly elevating himself to greater and greater heights. Whether that was justified or not is beside the point. Ankhtyphy presented himself as a man of status far beyond the ordinary. Even if he never says it, Ankhtyfy gives the vibe of being a king in all but name. Finally, there is his tomb. Ankhtyfy decided to build his tomb in the side of a hill. This mini mountain east of Moala stands alone on a spot of elevated ground overlooking the Nile. At a glance, it kind of looks like a pyramid. The hill is natural, it's just bedrock and sand, but in terms of shape, it more than fits the bill of a primeval mound, the place where reality began in the first waters of creation. Placing his tomb in that hill in such a freestanding and visible location kind of looks like Ankhtyfy was choosing a natural pyramid. We can't prove that was his intent. In the surviving inscriptions, Ankhtyfy never uses the word pyramid to describe his burial, but I would be very surprised if Ankhtyfy did not recognize the shape and the symbolism and consider it a good reason to build his tomb here. Finally, there is one more argument on Ankhtyphy's potentially royal-esque behavior. That scholar I mentioned earlier, Ludwig Morenz, discussed the site of Ankhtyphy's tomb and what it might signify about his intent. We know that Ankhtyphy was the overlord of Nekhen, or Hyricon Polis, but he didn't build his tomb at Nekhen or in the local cemetery. Instead, he constructed his monument several miles downriver at the site of Hefat, or Moala. He also built tombs for his sons alongside his own in that same natural pyramid hill. In his 2009 article, Morenz raises the possibility that Ankhtyphy was doing something that Old Kingdom rulers had done before, that he was establishing a new residence, a new center of authority and power, one that would be dominated by his funerary monument, and one that would be his sacred site. This had happened repeatedly in the Old Kingdom. Famous rulers like Meni, possibly Namer, had established Ineb-Hej, the White Wall, and in the age of pyramid building, rulers frequently moved their tombs to new, untapped locations. And when they did that, the government apparatus and the enormous workforce that built those pyramids would have to move to the new location. This meant that new towns regularly cropped up adjacent to those pyramids, and they sometimes persisted as their own long-lasting communities. The most famous example of this is the town called Men Nefer Pepi, which was attached to the pyramid of King Pepi I. Men Nefer went on to become the name of the local city, which we know better as the Greek Memphis. So it's possible that Ankhtyphy moved his tomb to the site of Hefat or Moala in order to do something similar. However, this is just a hypothesis. Ankhtyphy might have chosen Hefat or Moala because that was his home, the place where he grew up. While he was the ruler of Nekhen, that is an administrative title. It has nothing to do with his actual origins. And in his biography, Ankhtyphy often references Hefat and its people as a core part of his entourage and his business. So there's a good chance that Hefat is just Ankhtyphy's home, and he wanted to be buried in the place of his birth. The two ideas are not mutually exclusive, though. If Ankhtyphy did want to establish a new residence, then what better place to do so than his own hometown, a familiar location where he had influence and friends, and where his family could go to their rest alongside their father. The idea of establishing a residence is a very kingly thing to do. We have already discussed the Old Kingdom examples that came before Ankhtyphy. After Ankhtyphy, there would be many more. Kings like Amenemhat I would set up Itchitawi, Akhenaten would create Akhet-Aten, and the rulers of Dynasty 19 would build Pi-Ramesses, the House of Ramesses. Royal residences, palace cities, are a classic feature of new beginnings, attempts to set a new agenda, a new regime, at a new government location. Ankhtyphy might have been trying something similar. So Ankhtyphy essentially presents himself as a man almost a king, but just lacking the titles and imagery. You have to wonder, how would that sit with the actual king living in northern Egypt? Ankhtyfy does mention the northern kingdom in his biography. At one point, he even deals with them in an official capacity. This text is damaged, and it's a little bit hard for scholars to understand exactly what is going on. But in one translation, the text says, quote, "I have brought the counsel of the overseer of the south, who lives in the nome of Chenni or Thinis, to come and discuss the matter of the overseer of the priests, the great overlord of the district of Nekhen, who is named Hotep." End quote. Ankhtyfy brings a royal official, the overseer of the south, or Emira Shemau, in order to conduct some kind of business in the territory that he rules. It's a little bit unclear exactly what is happening here. The problem centers on this man whom Ankhtyfy mentions, the overseer of priests and great overlord of Nekhen, called Hotep. The text is damaged in this section, and it's missing a small phrase that seems to describe Ankhtyphy's relationship to Hotep. So, for scholars, this presents a complication in terms of chronology. When is this overseer of the south visiting Ankhtyphy's domain? Is it early in his career, before he became the great overlord? Or is it happening later? In the original publication of the tomb by Jacques Vandier, he interpreted this Hotep as Ankhtyphy's predecessor or perhaps his father. An alternative proposition is that Hotep is actually contemporary with Ankhtyphy, and that Ankhtyphy is bringing the royal official, the overseer of the south, to conduct some kind of investigation or lawsuit. I think the first interpretation is more likely. The idea that Hotep is Ankhtyphy's predecessor as the great overlord of Nekhen and overseer of the priests. Why do I think that? Well, those two titles, overseer of priests and overlord of Nekhen, they are shared by Ankhtyphy. But you can't have two officials with those same titles at the same time. There can only be one great overlord of a district, and only one overseer of priests for a specific community. So, unless something terribly unusual is happening here, it seems more likely that Ankhtyphy is describing events early in his career, before he ascended to those august positions. It's a little bit beside the point, but I bring it up for an important reason, to illustrate and remind just how many gaps there are in some of these historical records. When you are studying hieroglyphs carved on the wall, a little bit of damage in the wrong place can create serious issues for the historical reconstruction. We should always bear this in mind when we are trying to tell these stories. Little pieces of information that could be crucial have oftentimes been lost. Anyway, besides the reconstruction of relationships, what's important here is what this visit by the overseer of the south tells us about Ankhtyphy's relationship with the king. The overseer of the south, or Emira Shemau, is a royal agent, loyal to the house of Keti and serving their interests. We know several of the southern overseers from the Old Kingdom and First Intermediate period. They tend to appear in the regions of Abju or Abydos, Gebtu or Koptos, and Chenni or Thinis, all of which are part of the northern kingdom to varying degrees. We don't have time to deep dive into the overseers right now, but we will meet a couple of them in the next episodes. For now, the important thing is that Ankhtyphy dealt with them respectfully, and that suggests a certain level of respect or even subservience to the king in the north. But why would Ankhtyphy, a man who is so proud of his rule over the south, do something like that? For all his bravado, his annexations, and his raiding, Ankhtyphy was still part of the system. He was not a revolutionary trying to upend traditional power structures and hierarchies. He may have had aspirations to rise above his station and carve out his own power base, but he wasn't in the business of overthrowing traditions or convention. Ankhtyphy worked within the established rules of the country, the system of ma'at or order that had been handed down by the gods in ages long past. Ankhtyphy and the men like him were doing things their own way, but they were still following the customs of their society and culture. It's always important to remember that when we discuss these periods of breakdown. The political unity of the country may be challenged, even divided, but at a social level, there are still powerful ideas and concepts that bind the society together. Overlords may fight one another, they may annex each other's territory, but as far as we can tell, they're still loyal to an overarching ideal, the ideal of ma'at and the ideal of kingship. Ankhtyphy was riding high, but then there came a crisis. In a later section of his biography, Ankhtyphy describes a situation in which southern Egypt seems to have suffered a period of food shortages. The crisis was so bad that eventually it turned to famine, and in some cases, people had to resort to drastic measures to acquire the food they needed. Ankhtyphy's description is elaborate. It goes as follows, quote, "The hereditary prince, the overseer of priests, the overseer of troops, etc., etc. Ankhtyphy the Brave says the following, I gave bread to the one who was hungry, and clothing to the one who was naked. I purified the one who was not purified. I gave sandals to the one with bare feet. I took care of the towns at the moment when the sky was clouded and the earth was dust, when every man would die of hunger on this, the sandbank of Apep or Apophis. The whole of southern Egypt was dying of hunger, to the point that every man was forced to eat his own children. The whole country had become like starving locusts, going upstream and downstream in search of food." End quote. Ankhtyphy describes a situation in which the communities of southern Egypt faced an extended period of starvation, where the leaders of districts had to send out missions searching for food supplies, and in some cases, people resorted to cannibalism to sustain their lives. Ankhtyphy describes a situation of the utmost calamity, which may sound surprising. Everything had been going so well previously. The earlier sections of the biography do not give any hints of this developing storm. It all suddenly breaks, and the Southlands are in calamity. Presumably, this famine followed an extended period of drought. Ankhtyphy specifically mentions the sandbanks of Apophis, suggesting that the level of the river Nile and the level of the annual flood had diminished severely, revealing the sandy areas that normally were covered over. It sounds almost apocalyptic, as if the great serpent itself, who desires to swallow and destroy the sun, has come upon southern Egypt and is afflicting it with suffering. In other words, the situation was so bad it must have seemed like a divine catastrophe. Fortunately, the Overlord was here to help. Ankhtyphy describes his response to the situation, and naturally, it is rather heroic. Quote, I, Ankhtyphy, caused that nobody in my district died of hunger. I gave northern grain to southern Egypt, which was received as a ration. I cared for the house of Abu, Elephantine, and for the town of Iat Negen, the Mound of the Bulls, during those difficult years, after the towns of Hefat and Hormer had been satisfied. The south came with its people, the north came with its children. I reported this, and gave my southern grain. I made this southern grain make haste. To the south, the grain reached the land of Wawat, or Nubia, and in the north it reached the district of Chenni, or Thinis. I never allowed anybody to sail from one district to another looking for food. I caused the districts to live. because I am a brave man who does not have an equal." End quote. Ankhtyfy, supposedly, took care of the situation entirely on his own. He even organized food deliveries from the north, and he was able to provide land to neighboring regions such as Wawat or Nubia to the south. It sounds as though Ankhtyfy and his government organized a massive distribution of food, an extended aid project to alleviate the famine. This may sound a bit grandiose, and it is. Ankhtyfy is like that. And you'd be forgiven for asking, is there any truth to this? Is Ankhtyfy just making this up to make himself look good? Was there actually a famine in the south? Well, broadly speaking, I think there was. Ankhtyfy is not the only official from this period who mentions a time of hardship and food shortages. Across the First Intermediate period, we do have multiple inscriptions from different locations in which high-ranking officials mention these kinds of issues. For example, downriver from Ankhtyphy's territory, the city of Gebtu, or Koptos, leaves 2 records from prominent officers who worked to manage the food supply in their region. One was named Hen-Mes, who left an inscription describing the following, quote, "The overseer of priests, Jephi, sent me to the district of Yu-Shen-Shen. I found it ruined. I refounded the district. I brought back its cattle. I made an account of absolutely everything." End quote. Hen-Mes does not explicitly mention food shortages, but the priority he gives to cattle suggests that acquiring livestock was important, and apparently this region, Yu-Shen-Shen, had suffered some calamity. Meanwhile, one of Hen-Mes's contemporaries, a man named Seneni, left the following text, quote, "I measured out southern barley as sustenance for the whole town in the painful years of distress. Having acted thus in the proper manner, I was praised for it by the entire town." End quote. Seneni and Hen-Mes lived at the same general time. We know that because both officials reference a man called the Overseer of Priests, Jephi. We don't know who Jephi is exactly, there are no records or monuments for him, but both of these officials, Seneni and Hen-Mes, seem to have worked in Jephi's administration. And if you put them together, it seems like the town of Gebtu, Koptos, suffered at least a few years in which food shortages may have been an issue. Meanwhile, at the town of Iyunet, also known as Dendera, an official named Mereri left his own account of difficult times. Mereri said, quote, "I gave bread to the hungry, clothes to the naked. I saved the victim from the hand of the one who was stronger. I filled the granaries with northern barley and spelt, with cattle and goats. I labored for my town in its entirety." End quote. Mereri's account is a little bit more generic, but like Hen-Mes and Seneni, he puts a great premium on the acquisition and storage of food, similar to how Ankhtyfy described his response to the shortages. Then, a man named Iti lived in a town quite close to Ankhtyphy's territory. This town is called Yu-Em-Iteru, or Island in the River. Iti says the following, quote, "I was a worthy citizen who acted with his arm. I was a great pillar in the district of Waset, or Thebes, a man of status in the Southland. I nourished my town, Yu-Em-Iteru, in the years of misery. Although 400 men were in dire straits because of these years, I did not seize a man's daughter, nor did I take his field. I acquired 10 herds of goats, with herdsmen for each herd. I acquired 2 herds of cattle and 1 herd of asses. I acquired all kinds of small cattle. I made a boat of 50 cubits long and another of 30 cubits. I gave southern barley to the town of Iyunu, or Armant, and to Hefat, or Mawala, after my own town, Yu-Em-Iteru, had been supplied. While the district of Waset, or Thebes, traveled downstream and upstream in search of food, I never allowed my town to do so." End quote. Finally, In the region of Waset, or Thebes itself, we have records describing a time of hardship. A man called Rehui mentioned how, quote, I provided for the temple of Amun in difficult years of hunger. Then a man called Jari recorded how his governor sent him on a mission to acquire food. Jari said how, quote, the ruler of Waset caused me to travel downstream to acquire sustenance consisting of weak barley. Finally, a man called Chetepi mentioned how, quote, a hunger of many years came to pass in this district of Waset. The threshing floor was dry. The district never received harvest revenue from any farmer in the years of hunger, when grain was missing. End quote. These reports from Gebtu, Waset, and other places might date to different rulers, and they might not be describing the same famine. But that kind of emphasizes the point. Across the early First Intermediate period, we have multiple accounts from different locations mentioning a time of hunger. What was happening? Previously, we explored the collapse of the Old Kingdom, which took place gradually over centuries. One of the most important records from that period is evidence for a slow decline in the level of the Nile flood. Those Nile records stop around 2350 BCE, during the 5th dynasty of the Egyptian kingship. So they're about 200 years earlier than the First Intermediate period. With that in mind, we can't be sure that the Nile floods had continued to diminish. But given the texts left by Ankhtyfy and others, it seems quite likely that there was another short period of low Nile floods. Ankhtyfy specifically mentions a riverbank of Apophis, suggesting that the flood had diminished so severely that the edges of the Nile were becoming dry and desiccated, and the references to a lack of harvest revenue when grain was missing suggest that at least for a few years, the floods were not rising high enough to cover the fields and renew the farmland. If that situation repeated, even just a few years in a row, it could have led to utter calamity and famine in southern Egypt. It's not clear if this was a single continuous period of drought or a repeating one coming and going over several years. The way the texts describe it, it sounds like a single event. But since we cannot pinpoint many of these texts along a chronology, we can't say all of them line up in the exact same date, it is possible they are describing several periods of hardship over generations. Then again, you may be wondering, were things actually that bad? Given what we know about ancient Egyptian biographies, they do have a tendency to exaggerate. At least when it comes to the deeds of their owners. Everyone was the best at something. Everybody did something that had never been done before. That kind of exaggeration and hyperbole is a common feature of ancient testimonials. So we have to ask, does that apply to these famine descriptions as well? Could they be exaggerating the scale of the crisis? This is one of the big questions of the First Intermediate period. In the old days, scholars relied almost exclusively on texts and art, and in the early 20th century, academics perceived the records to show a time of total collapse, hardship, and chaos. The problem started with texts like the Lamentations of Ipuwer, a literary work that I introduced in recent episodes. The author of that text described a general period of hardship that might be the First Intermediate period, or it might not. But that imagined hardship included descriptions of loss and poverty, and the author said things like, quote, "Oh, the ship of the south is in chaos. Towns are ravaged. Southern Egypt has become empty or sandbanks. The people are few. The man who buries his brother is everywhere. The desert is throughout the land. Even high-ranking women are saying, if only we had something to eat. Even the officials are hungry. People eat only plants. They cannot find seeds or birds. The grain is ruined. Everyone is saying, there is nothing. The storehouse is bare or empty." End quote. The Lamentations of Ipuwer were probably written after the First Intermediate period, and naturally there is academic debate around whether this text, and others like it, are providing a semi-accurate account of what might have happened, or if they are simply stories, even propaganda, making the past seem worse in order to make their own time seem better. It's a complicated question. Broadly speaking, there are two schools of thought. There's a minimalist position, where some scholars think that these texts, especially the literary ones, are largely exaggerated, and that the First Intermediate period wasn't all that bad, really. Then there is the maximalist position, historians who think that no, these accounts are too numerous and too ubiquitous to discount as exaggerations. The literary works, like the Lamentations of Ipuwer, might build up a grandiose picture for dramatic effect, but that does not mean there were not genuine crises during this time. And when you put them together with the historical records, the biographical texts that I just read to you, the general picture seems quite consistent. There was hunger and famine at one point in this period. You will find the minimalist position in the work of scholars like Richard Parkinson, who specializes in Middle Kingdom literature and has published extensively on those topics. You'll find the maximalist position in the work of scholars like Fakhri Hassan and Ellen Morris. The latter, in particular, has published extensively on the subject of famine and hardship, both in ancient Egypt and in more recent accounts. In 2023, Professor Ellen Morris published a book titled Famine and Feast in Ancient Egypt, and she compared the ancient literary accounts, like the Lamentations of Ipuwer, with more recent accounts of drought, famine, and suffering. This included records from Egypt itself during the medieval and early modern periods, and instances of modern famine. To put it quite simply, Morris found that even in situations with multiple eyewitness accounts and thorough documentations of hardship and suffering, it can be extremely difficult for people living outside of that, in positions of comfort and security, to fully credit and accept the descriptions of the hardship. For example, the survivors of the siege of Leningrad during World War II had to go to extreme and horrible lengths in order to survive. And yet, despite the incredibly well-documented suffering of that city and that global conflict, it has been all too easy for observers to dismiss it as exaggeration or hyperbole. Furthermore, these experiences can have long-term effects on the individuals and communities that suffer through them. This can manifest in curious ways, including a kind of denial from the survivors themselves, not denying that it happened, but an unwillingness to discuss or even think about the problem in their post-trauma life. What this means for the First Intermediate period, for Ankhtyfy and his contemporaries? Well, I think Morris has raised an important point. Although ancient Egyptian biographies do tend to exaggerate, especially in the deeds of their owners, the accounts of food shortages, of long-term sufferings and hardships in southern Egypt at this time, those accounts are too numerous, too consistent, and too widespread across a geographic region for us to simply discount them. We should still treat these sources carefully. We do not assume they are telling facts in every single word and phrase. But the idea of a long-term drought leading to food shortages and thus to famine, that seems to be fairly well documented in this period. And while Ankhtyfy is undoubtedly a boaster, when he describes situations like the riverbank turning to sand due to lack of water, as if Apophis himself was striking the land, when he describes people suffering terrible starvation and even turning to cannibalism in order to survive, we should treat those accounts seriously. They may sound dramatic, potentially even exaggerated, but as modern examples illustrate, that does not mean they didn't happen. Around 2060 BCE, give or take, southern Egypt may have suffered a famine. This probably came from a drought, a period of low Nile floods that caused the water table to decrease and left the edges of the Nile dry, desiccated, and sandy. It was as if the great serpent, the devourer Apophis, had come down upon the land, just as he sought to devour the sun up in the sky. References and descriptions of this famine are numerous and consistent across a wide stretch of southern Egypt, and the traumas of this experience might have persisted in cultural memory to be expressed in stories like the Lamentations of Ipu Wer. Academics have their debates about what exactly is historical information, what exactly is poetic license or imagination. But as modern observers looking back over the full span of human history, we should always remember that these experiences can leave deep, scarring impacts on the communities that experience them. Around 2060 BCE, communities in southern Egypt may very well have suffered terribly. However, while the texts do paint a bleak picture, we should not imagine it was all doom and gloom all the time. The First Intermediate Period lasted for at least 150 years, several generations of human society and history. Notably, the inscriptions and texts that I have referenced often lack important details that allow us to pinpoint them to specific dates and times. In other words, it's unclear if there was a single large famine lasting for several years, or if there were smaller, shorter famines taking place periodically over decades. That doesn't make it better, any hunger is bad, but if the famines were more staggered, taking place over decades, then communities would at least have time to recover in between instances of hardship. This might be visible in the archaeological record. As we went through the autobiography of Ankhtyfy, the Overlord frequently described other communities in the region. One place that he focused on was Edfu, the town of Behdet in the district of Wetches Kher, the throne of Horus. Ankhtyfy described Edfu as inundated like a marsh and disregarded by its overlord. Put that together with the descriptions of famine and hunger, and you might imagine a city like Edfu was in utterly dire straits during the First Intermediate Period. Fortunately, we can check that. Since 2007, an archaeological team has been excavating the ancient town of Edfu. This is a settlement just next door to the great Horus temple, and partly buried beneath it as well. The team is currently led by Professor Nadine Moella and Dr. Gregory Marawad, both at Yale University. And over the past few years, they've published a lot of material about Edfu during the early periods. To begin with, the town is old, at least 3000 BCE and probably older. Artifacts and archaeological material show that Edfu was operating throughout the Old Kingdom. It had a large housing area and mud brick walls surrounding the town. It had a cemetery with mastaba tombs for high-ranking officials. There was royal activity, probably for the Temple of Horus, and statues of Old Kingdom rulers, like Pepi I, show that Edfu was a major center for royal government business. In fact, Edfu even has a pyramid, a small step pyramid, probably built around 2650 BCE, maybe the reign of Sneferu or his predecessor, Huni. That pyramid is ceremonial rather than a tomb, one of several built during the era as markers of royal authority. So, during the Old Kingdom, Edfu was a significant center. By 2100 BCE, the early First Intermediate Period, all of that royal activity seems to disappear. Edfu is a long way from the Northern Kingdom, and chances are the House of Keti had very little power in this region, so the city was no longer an outpost of royal government. And Ankhtyphy's autobiography adds to that picture, describing Edfu as abandoned by its ruler, left to drift without capable or proper management. And yet, archaeological work over the past decade and a half reveal a far more nuanced picture of the Edfu settlement and its people. Across the 150 years or so of the First Intermediate period, the town of Edfu seems to have undergone significant and rapid changes. The town itself actually grew during this period, expanding past its old city limits and incorporating new areas. This growth might have been quite rapid. The locals had to build an entirely new wall of mud brick to surround the expanding town. But when they built that wall, they did not plan it carefully to go around any pre-existing areas. As a result, the new wall occasionally builds over or cuts through pre-existing structures. That includes part of the old cemetery, and some of the Old Kingdom mastabas were incorporated into the new wall. That suggests, tentatively, that the locals were building this wall in a hurry. Perhaps they felt an urgent need for new defenses. Or perhaps there was a period in which a large number of people flocked to the city and took up residence within. We see some responses to this rapid growth, including the addition of new storage facilities, large pottery jars sunk into the earth to hold grain, beer, or vegetables. These storage spaces might be a local response to the shifting fortunes of the outside world. If food shortages had become an issue in the region, perhaps they were making sure they always had a stockpile that they would not suffer in the future. This is a tentative interpretation. Edfu is a large site with an incredibly long history. The First Intermediate period is one tiny slice of that history. So it's going to take a long time before scholars can comprehensively describe this particular era and provide interpretations of what was happening. But what is published so far paints a tantalizing image of a town responding to changing circumstances, a town possibly experiencing an influx of refugees moving rapidly into the community, a town growing and taking precautions for the future. However you look at it, the picture is not one of collapse and ruin, of mismanagement and abandonment. If anything, it is a picture of resilience, of continuity and endurance in the face of hardship. Whatever was happening in the outside world, the town of Edfu was standing strong, and they were clearly doing their best to offset those hardships. There are other towns and archaeological sites which scholars have investigated for the First Intermediate period. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all of them in the detail I would really like. If you are interested, the scholar Nadine Moella does have a lecture about these towns, which is available on YouTube. I'll put a link in the description to that presentation. It covers the material from Edfu and other communities in southern Egypt. It is a fascinating phase of ancient Egyptian history, and if you're interested in daily life, how people actually lived, this is a worthwhile topic of study. For now, we'll just leave it with Edfu. Around 2060 BCE, southern Egypt may have suffered a period of hardship. This could have been a single, sustained famine lasting several years, or a time of food shortages that came and went with variations in the climate. This did not result in the utter degradation and collapse of every town in the south. Archaeological work at major sites does show evidence for resilience, adaptation, and even development in the face of these hardships. Nevertheless, the historical texts preserved on stelae, in tombs, and in biographies suggest that for several years at least, people of southern Egypt had to face difficult choices to obtain the food they needed. This is most elaborately described by the Overlord Ankhtyfy, who, by the end of his career, was riding high as the powerful man of the south. He had unified 3 districts: the district of Nekhen, or Hierokonpolis, the district of Edfu, or Wetches Kher, the throne of Horus, and the district of Ta Seti, the land of the bow, and its major community at Abu, or Elephantine. Ankhtyfy controlled a long stretch of the Nile Valley, and he oversaw the military and economic affairs of multiple communities in this region. As the sun reached its peak on his career, he could justifiably claim to be the great overlord of the south. He didn't carry that title, that belonged to another official living in the north. But all of Ankhtyphy's actions, and even the way he describes himself and prepared for his burial, suggest a man aspiring well above the strict limits of his titles. In name, Ankhtyphy was an overlord of districts, an overseer of priests and troops, a friend of the royal household and a participant in the system. But between the lines, behind those texts, he seems almost like a king. So why didn't he establish a kingdom? Next time, we will see the end of Ankhtyphy's career and the formal breaking of Egypt into two distinct lands. Ankhtyphy had achieved much while nominally working within the system. But just downriver from his home communities, the leaders of a town called Waset, or Thebes, were about to take the next logical step. They would expand their influence over neighboring communities. And then, one of their leaders, an overlord called Intef, would make his own bid for royal legitimacy. The kings of Egypt, living in the north, were about to face a competitor, and before too long, things would turn to violence. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. Before I go, let me give a shout out to the priests, my top tier supporters on patreon.com. These fine folks enable me to put food on my table, for which I am eternally grateful. My thanks must go to Andy and Chelsea, Kyla, Terry, Eric, Yola, Mycost, Linda, TJ, Ashley, Nidin, Veronica, James, and Arthur. Folks, you are all too generous. May your communities continue to thrive and grow. May you build walls of the strongest mud brick that overcome all obstacles and endure for millennia. May your households never suffer shortage. To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you're enjoying the show, and I will see you soon.